Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury podcast. I'm Craig Jeffery. I'm your host today. I'm joined by Dave Robertson. Dave, welcome to the Treasury Update podcast.
Thank you, Craig. Very happy to be here.
Glad you're in our offices doing some recordings. Go ahead and describe what you do, what role you have at your current organization.
Yeah, thank you for that. CashPath Advisors really does work for two constituents. One is the office of the CFO, and there we're helping companies be as automated, real-time, intelligent, digital as they can be. So work in working capital, treasury, and financial operations. And then the other thing we do is we work with banks and other financial service providers. And really, we've been focused on fee and deposit growth initiatives. We've been focused on sales enablement, really trying to bring more diagnostic consultative expertise into the sales process. And then we're also doing transformation work around large project migration or even mergers.
We'll put the link to your website in the show notes. Everybody who's listening, today's episode is application of AI in Treasury. So the application of artificial intelligence in Treasury. So from taking it from theory to practice, we'll begin looking at a definition of some of the AI terms that people have. I'll cover some of them. And Dave, maybe you can talk a little bit on the language learning models, large or small. The way we see most organizations defining it, most people defining it, now fits with machine learning as one of the types of AI. This is pattern detection, determining processes that are used in data, organizing it so the machine can learn from data that exists. That would be the first, simplest one. The next one would be generative AI, or this is the creation. So maybe you're familiar with ChatGPT, anybody who's listening, generating images, generating new content, writing things. It could even be writing something for LinkedIn. Like, here's a post. It's like you want to clean it up. And so it'll help generate content, as that's referred to as generative AI or Gen AI. And then there's agentic AI, or that's using agents, bots, if you will, that do functions. And a sequence of these agents allow you to complete various steps. And so this is if you're familiar with robotic process automation or RPA, this is the next version of that, RPA for artificial intelligence, helping to run a process that's done less in a pure rules-based environment that also has some intelligence associated with that. So it can make more decisions as opposed to reading an invoice and always looking in a particular spot. It can make those additional decisions about what needs to be done for handling decisions on cash flow forecasting or any particular topic. So those are the first three. Maybe you could talk through language models. What are we referring to there when we talk about language models?
Yeah, you'll hear the term large language models and then sometimes micro LLMs or small language models. And to me, a language model is really an incredible breakthrough where, typically if we're analyzing quantitative data, we know how to do that. But language is not quantitative, right? And things mean different things. Really what a large language model does, and I'm not a technologist, I'll have that disclaimer, but it converts language into a vectorized quantitative data, and it's looking for tangents. And so it is doing pattern detection, similar to machine learning, but within qualitative information. And that gives it a lot of ability to parse through massive amounts of data, find patterns, synthesize them, and pull together responses. And so that's been a huge breakthrough. And obviously, the greatest example of LLM would be like a ChatGPT or a Claude or a Gemini, where you can just have a natural language dialogue, and this model is going into incredible rich data to try to come back with answers for you.
So the difference between a large language model, like you said, like ChatGPT or Copilot, or one of the other ones where it's basically scouring the internet, if you will, to a micro or a small language model, how would you describe the difference of use for that?
I think there could be two reasons for it, right? One is how much control do you want to exert over the data? And so obviously you can create proprietary data sets for a large language model and really control the data that's in there. The second thing is, if you think about how a large language model works, it is like machine learning. It's actually finding like what is the closest tangent that's relevant, and it's compiling it that way. So the more data you have a trade-off between how rigorously do I interrogate this data versus how do I come back with a pattern. So if I know I have a finite set of things I want to ask, if I can restrict that data set, I can actually tune up the depth of inquiry and come up with much better responses. What we're doing at CashPath Advisors is we're creating a specific Treasury LLM. And the reason for that are a couple reasons, which I think also lend them to just the general question of why do a micro or small LLM. The first is that there's very particular expertise. And if you look at Treasury, like you do great content, some of the banks do great content, but probably 60% of what you need to know is not available. The second thing is that Treasury is a domain that has what's called high semantic variability. So if I say something to you and you say something to someone else, we could be using the same words and meaning different things. And a great example, that's liquidity management. Like you could ask 10 people, what is liquidity management? And actually not come back with 10 different responses, but come back with 40 different responses. And then the third issue is all of these high-powered large language models involve data going outside of a firewall for a query. They may have disclaimers that say, we're only going to use your data to answer your question. We're not going to use it to train our models. But when you think about something like a Treasury department or a finance function of a company, you don't want sensitive data leaving the firewalls. An LLM that is a micro LLM allows you to kind of encapsulate that data in a vectorized database and put it on site, on premises, so that the query and the dialogue that's going on never needs to leave the company's firewalls.
You talked about vectorizing, and one of the things that will come up, one of the terms that we'll talk about as an issue later, but I wanted to talk about that now, is hallucinations. So you ask questions, and it's, why do we get hallucinations? And part of it comes to this vectorization, or this, just trying to figure out what closely approximates the answer to the question. I didn't mean to spring this on you, but did you want to talk about why these models come up with hallucinations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Claiming the models are intelligent to me it's almost sacrilegious because they don't have the same function as our brain. They're just detecting patterns. And you can pull together patterns and clearly come up with the wrong answer. And the way I think about this is way back when, pre-LLMs, grad students in the qualitative studies had to do what they called constant coding, where they're just tagging qualitative data sets with meta tags, and then they're going back and analyzing them. So if you have a complex question, maybe you phrase it in a vague manner, the model is going to just look for the closest set of answers and come back to you. And it's certainly incumbent on anybody using AI, especially a broad query, as opposed to an orchestrated recurring event. You need to tune the prompts. You need to interrogate the responses and come back with it. I think the better the models get, there's still hallucination, but you're just pushing the hallucination further and further out. And part of what companies can do if they have proprietary LLMs is they can certainly understand the boundaries of what it works well for and what it doesn't work well for. And they can even put in prompts to make the AI model skeptical and less open to hallucination.
It'd be nice if it also sourced where it came from, where it got the information from, especially since it's going through massive amounts of proprietary data.
Yeah.
It tends not to give the reference of where you got it, right?
Right.
The episode is Application of AI in Treasury. There's quite a bit of AI that's being used in Treasury today. Obviously, a huge potential future. Maybe we could talk through some of the examples of how AI is used in Treasury today, 2025. It's in use, and where is it going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of applications. The first is if you think about Treasury, there's different kinds of problems that are faced by Treasury. One is making a good decision. But if you were to ask most treasurers, what's most frustrating to them, it would be just getting their hands on data and getting the data into an environment that allows them to interrogate it and make sense of it. So I kind of like to zero base and start from the foundation, which is AI gives us the ability to gather information that would have been probably impractical to gather. So an example could be even email threads. An example could be, let's say I'm doing a forecast and I want to forecast my collection activities. I may have a collection forecast coming out of AR, but I also might have a whole bunch of, let's call them case study notes in phone calls and emails back and forth. And I could actually interrogate that and say, not only do I have an email that says this customer's told me they're going to pay me on this date, not only do I have the history showing that when they've said they're going to pay something, they pay it, but I might even have some sentiment analysis where maybe there's even a recorded phone call and the company is being kind of dissembling and saying things that are illogical. And I pick up on that and I'm like, whoa, that's at risk. And so that data could obviously enrich a forecast. We had another example as well, and I have to credit Real Treasury with coming up with this one, but it was an example of a company that was trying to understand the impact of tariffs. And they took their SKUs and put it through AI and came back with what the impacts of the tariffs were on those SKUs, which could then be pulled into financial forecasts and planning as well.
Based on product and source country.
Yeah, and so if you were to try to do that manually, that would just be mind-numbing and slow and probably inaccurate. Not to say the AI is perfectly accurate, but for some things where the general knowledge is well documented, things like government regulations, you can really parse those and engineer those in a way that are useful to you. We've certainly seen it in working capital too, right? Where if I get in a PDF or an email with just text, I can digitize that and pull that into an environment where I can make sense of it for reconciliation, posting, managing disputes, and things of that nature. So right off the bat, generally, when I'm working with an office of the CFO, I'm thinking with AI, what are the main data challenges and can we use AI to solve them? I think once people get comfortable with those foundational data issues, you start to get into really interesting use cases. And we've seen some small companies crop up that are trying to do much better credit risk analysis. And so you might be aware, like if there's a privately held company that I have a credit exposure to, I don't know what's going on with them. There's no stock price, but scouring the web, finding their press releases, LinkedIn posts, job boards, Glassdoor ratings, social media, I can now pull that information together, and it's not going to be perfect, but it might say to me, hey, based on the size of the counterparty exposure you have here, and based on what we're seeing, we think you should go in and manually validate this company's credit position or take positions to mitigate the risk here because we're seeing these signals that are problematic. Years ago, getting that data would have been very costly and very difficult to gather.
And it made access to credit harder. And you can see some of the different ERP systems or accounting platforms. They have the financial data of an organization, and they leverage that for doing a credit score, offering credit that's very easy. It's using AI and machine learning to make capital access much more democratic. It's automatic and democratic, and it goes through it, which that wasn't possible before without that. Now, obviously, they can't share that information outside that environment, but that's a good use case. Let's talk briefly about data validation. This idea of if we have to train our bots, our machines to do well, we have to get data in, and the old adage is that garbage in, garbage out. Nobody expected the data to be this bad. Is there some solution? Are there ways of solving it with these bots to make the data better for a cleaner experience?
Yeah, and if you think about data validation, it's not that you're trying to validate every piece of data, although sometimes you can reconcile to do that and you can compare the sum to the total. But if you think about like what a fraud tool does, a fraud tool is, which of these things don't belong here. And you can flag outliers pretty easily with AI, not just for quantitative data, but even qualitative data. If somebody writes something back and there's something that just doesn't make sense, you can flag these kind of outliers. And, there might be very good reasons for them, but you're now investigating data sets and specific things to validate the data, which you can do through conversations, double checking, et cetera. And having a human run, let's say Python code or something to do that, yes, you can do it. But AI is basically just using the same pattern detection to flag those outliers. That can be a huge benefit.
Forecasting is a key area of Treasury, liquidity management for most organizations. And part of that is variance analysis. Any thoughts on how can AI help us with variance analysis?
I think there's multiple angles there. One is just producing the variance. So doing the mapping, an AI-based mapping of the incoming transactions to the forecast categories can be richer. And that allows you to do two things. If you think about the forecast, you could have a three-dimensional forecast with different tags on different types of expenses and disbursements and incoming. You could tag things by channel. So now you've gone from a one-dimensional variance, this category moved, to, hey, actually, it was this business unit, these products, this channel is kind of where we saw the differences. So you can do tagging in multiple dimensions much more easily. You can automate the incoming transactions being mapped much better. And then on the outset of the variance, once you have the variance produced, and now maybe it's a three-dimensional variance, just interpreting it and saying, zero in for me, what's the 80-20 here? What are the few things that are really driving this variance? You can do that with a human eye for sure, but it enables a level of leverage to that skilled resource where now they're picking up the phone and they're talking to people and they're having concrete discussions. They're spending less time putting together reports, analyzing the reports, trying to make sense of them. It gives you a head start. I don't know that you would put 100% into that bucket. You're still going to validate it, but 90% of kind of that busy work goes away. And maybe there are patterns and things that you would not have caught. That AI has a level of rigor, and plugging the tokens in, it doesn't get tired. Maybe you have a nuclear reactor in the back of your company. Now you're finding insights that you wouldn't have found otherwise.
The nuclear reactor is providing all the power to run the machines.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I think one other thing that we should be cognizant of is that when you're doing a variance analysis, the typical pattern has been is, let's say you have a system that's geared for finance or treasury, and it's you build your model and your flow and you see which category was off. There's a certain rigidity to that structure. Mm-hmm. And if you find a better way to do it, or you start to tag new things, it's usually from that point forward. And now with some of the new platforms, the new systems, the ability to use AI, you can tag back in time and so have a better history of that, which wasn't really possible. It was always from this point forward. Now it's the look back.
That's a great point. And how quickly it does that, it's not a huge effort. It's just like, go back and tell me about the last 3 years variances with this kind of a mapping, and it can do that.
You change your new forecast model and see, well, this one's better than the prior one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Those are a lot of happy stories, good things. What about the dangers we have? We already talked about hallucinations to some extent, but I know there's issues of, you mentioned not wanting your confidential data, your PII or confidential data being leaked out.
Mm-hmm.
There's issues of the black box. We don't know how things work. Those are at least three of the concerns. Tell me about how you're thinking through AI in these areas.
Yeah. So I kind of started building a Treasury LLM as a lark, just as kind of like a little hobby project. But in doing that, I started talking to different people, operating partners, CFOs, people in the industry. And not 100%, but probably 80% of them said, there's a limit to what you can use when the data goes outside the firewall. And let's say you're a company and you're getting ready to do an acquisition. God forbid the treasurer says, hey, what should I be thinking about when I'm acquiring this kind of company? And all of a sudden someone has that data and your acquisition target is now, 40% more expensive. Now that's obviously a very edge use case, but Treasury, it's a big job because it's dealing with very sensitive information. And so I think you can have these quote unquote protections that the AI tool is not going to misuse your data. But in point of fact, try to get that explained to you in concrete terms. What does that mean? Because you're having a dialogue with a system that has some memory of your chats to have context with you. How does that not consume some portion of the data? And I find that if you really push back on these sort of generic disclosures, they're very hard to understand. And so if I'm a CFO trying to safeguard confidential information, there's a whole set of things I don't want going outside my firewalls. I think that's going to be a huge frontier. Now, the good news is while that's happening, AI tools themselves are becoming much easier to adopt inside the firewall and very powerful and easy to use. So I think that's kind of an offsetting thing there. But my major concern is not allowing confidential information to leave the firewall. That's kind of the first one.
One aspect of a lot of the large language learning models it's taking data, taking a lot of proprietary data, confidential data, or copyrighted data and using it and then spitting it out for free. It's not spit it out exactly the same way. And I think there's an aspect of that I think is problematic because the IP and the work that went into that in the beginning is now being used for free. That's a whole nother podcast, not for our channel.
Yeah, the amount of lawsuits. It's funny. My father was a patent attorney, so he dealt with IP law, and then he was also a hobbyist in AI. So he was writing a program prior to his passing that would solve detective stories, and then in solving the detective story, it would rank how good the mystery was based on whether the answer was some random bizarre thing or it actually had a complex problem to solve. So he had this whole thought of creating a hierarchy of mysteries based on the complexity of it. But I do think like when it comes to IP, everybody's just grabbing everything, and there's going to have to be, first of all, as a consulting firm, you're putting a ton of content out there, right? And that's a social good. It obviously brands your company. But if people use that without attestation or
attribution or anything.
It's going to encourage people to basically keep all their content behind firewalls. And then we're gradually just going to all get stupider as a result of that.
Yeah, we've always had what we share publicly and what we keep privately. And it is surprising how much gets used without attribution. People can have certain similar thoughts, but there's certain things it's just too much. And hallucinations is the other topic. Anything you wanted to add on that?
Well, hallucinations in the black box. And I think, to me, there's responsible use of AI, which is, I like to think of it as augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, because I think what frustrates people, even like professors, is where you've outsourced your thinking to the AI. That's not what we want. We want the AI to augment you. So you should understand the logic of what you're offering. It should enable you to be a better thinker. And when it comes to things like hallucinations and black box, the nice thing about AI is you can interrogate it as to its thinking. Did you think about this? How did you weight this factor versus this factor? And it should be able to give you a response. Many of the AIs now will also prompt and show you the sources that are available to what's behind the thinking there. And you can go to the source document and look at it. Some of these deep research tools literally have like a bibliography and coding and citing the sources, which is pretty thorough.
Here's the audit trail of the thoughts or how it was put together.
Yeah.
I think that's really useful because sometimes you get an output and you keep asking questions, especially when you know it's wrong. It's hallucinated or it's missing data. And then you ask multiple times, you get still wrong answers. And you're trying to guide and teach it. And sometimes ChatGPT or whatever doesn't take the correction as well. It's always kind. It's like, oh, sorry.
Well, the classic example is people are asking LLMs to do math. And the way they work now is they say, oh, this is a math problem. I'm going to have Python answer that, because the LLMs would just get it comically wrong. And so there are things that can do well. There's things where it can be provocative. And there's things where you don't want it providing an answer. And you just have to be, I think, a smart consumer of it.
Yeah, if you're looking for math, maybe you should look at a large math model, not a large language model, right? It's like You're in the wrong category for sure. Black box. I think we talked about that whole background that helps you create it. If there's some kind of audit or follow-up of how did you come up with this? Why did you rely on it? When things are off by an order of magnitude or the misdirection, it's very helpful to challenge it.
I have a funny thought on that. I think AI is a black box. It's not as bad of a black box as some CFOs and treasurers that I've seen. And so they're there making these judgments to do X or to do Y. And you look at the rationale, it's not rigorously documented. The logic trail is not evident. And, you and I are trained consultants, the scientific method, what's our hypotheses, what's our data. And I think generally, the people I would be most scared of hallucinating are the same people who are operating as a black box. And, in Treasury, what form does this take? Well, I've done this before. I'm an expert. Well, explain this instance. Oh, yeah, this is how you do it. Like, what are the options? What are the parameters? How did you come to this decision? If I'm, as a treasurer, I have that mindset, I'm using the scientific methodology, I'm being rigorous, I'm not going to just take AI and ingest it stupidly. So if you're worried about the black box of Treasury, the answer is don't be a black box. Be a rigorous thinker and have AI be part of your thinking. But don't just, just like you wouldn't want a treasurer to say, we've done it this way always, and that's why we're going to do it this way. You don't want to just take what AI is telling you and execute that.
That idea of documenting it, sometimes we have a gut feeling. And it might be a right gut feeling, but think about why. This doesn't feel right. What about it doesn't feel right? There's something anomalous here. Maybe I can't determine what's anomalous. Like, I have this weird feeling when I enter the room. Why? Okay. Well, someone was going to mug me. How did you pick up that something was not right? And you may not know it, but you detected that. And it's also helpful to detect why there might be something anomalous, something different. And I think we're pretty good at detecting it consciously, subconsciously, but factoring that in, why that matters, is extremely useful, right? Oh, this bank is in trouble. Why do we know that? Oh, there's this type of chatter. Well, that might be a bit of a myth, but now I'm at least paying attention. Is there more corroborating evidence there?
The intuitive and non-articulable mind is incredibly powerful. Now, do you know the story of a dog catching a Frisbee?
I don't remember.
So if you throw a Frisbee to a dog, how does it catch the Frisbee?
Jumps up and bites it.
It's doing a second-order differential equation.
Okay.
Right? And so, but if you put the dog in front of the blackboard, it's not going to explain that. But its mind is capable of doing a second-order differential equation. So, think about how powerful your mind is. Now, if you can actually break that down in a way that can be communicated and defended to others, that's incredibly powerful.
So Chat Dog will be the how to do Diffie cues with canines. Canine Diffie cues. Let's get that website locked in before this goes live. A Treasury large language model. So you've been working on building one. You mentioned it was on the Lark. Why are you building that?
Yeah. So I think if you look at Treasury generally, it's got the semantic variability. It's got a lot of missing data. And unlike, let's say, law or medicine, it's not been parameterized well. It really needs more of an engineering approach to it. And so as I'm thinking about this large language model and agentic functions on the back end, I'm thinking obviously just practically, let's give people advice, let's help them. But I also think people like you and I can impose some order on Treasury. It needs a better taxonomy for things. It needs more breaking down of the logic structure into common terms, common functions, common parameters. And that's going to allow for just a much richer industry with a lot more expertise and a lot more automation. If you think about let's create a fake Treasury union that wants to just do jobs based on expertise. That Treasury union is just going to make Treasury as complicated and obfuscated as possible. And that protects the job of the expert. But it also reduces collaboration. It reduces scalability of the function. And I don't think we're going to get there overnight because it's a very complex subject. But it's also a very immature industry. You go back 100 years, how much was there of a Treasury role? It's really a relatively new phenomenon as companies have become far more financial. So part of what I see this LLM is part of the maturing of the industry into a better defined, more collaborative, a little bit more academic, if you will, approach to the nature of the very important challenges that it's solving.
In thinking about large language models or building better AI tools, what are some of the practical considerations that are there? It has to be safe, protected. What else should we be?
There's a couple things I see with companies. One is they struggle between doing AI as a top-down initiative and really letting people loose with AI. And I understand the perspective of centralizing it because if you do it poorly, right, you've just opened Pandora's box. But really,
Pandora's box at scale.
At scale. Yeah, at scale. Pandora's box at scale. That's a good way to think of it. But where the value is going to come is with line employees engaged in it and driving change with it. And so one practical challenge, I think, for a company is very quickly coming up with a strategy for AI and unleashing it within the company, giving tools, what environments can some tools be used in, what environment can others be used in, and really kind of opening it up. There's got to be a lot more experimentation. I generally find companies are moving too slowly.
On the moving too slowly, is it that they should be doing some more piloting and running things in parallel, or they should be moving more things into production more rapidly, or something else?
I think really both. Thinking of it as a big bang sometimes is correct. But if you think about some of these use cases we talked about, they're finite, they're discrete, they're fairly small. And I would much rather invest in a company that had 1,000 small experiments where they're piloting Right? It's got to be responsible. I'm not saying just go out and fly through it, but you do have to experiment, pilot, run in parallel, and institutionalize. And I'd much rather have a lot of people doing that than 4 super smart people doing it, because the tools are so accessible. They're so easy to use that creating an artificial boundary to having people engage in them, I think, is undermining the value that they can deliver.
A question for you, and this is at least amusing on my part and wondering where it goes, as we look at agentic AI using agents compared to robotic process automation and compared to some of the other activities that exist, the level of increase in efficiency, workload, maybe not quality, but even keeping quality the same, it seems to me that it's a full order of magnitude, 10 times, maybe it's 20 times or perhaps more than what we saw with the last version of tech. Is that what you're seeing? And then I have some follow-up questions to that too.
Yeah, and I think we're early, right? So when I think of robotic process automation, I always think of it as the automation of last resort. Nothing else worked. I'm just going to brute code this, and I'm going to have it imitate what a human would do.
Yep.
Going into a buyer portal and pulling down data. To me, agentic AI is programming a virtual robot and designating how much autonomy you want it to have. You could clearly create an agentic AI to invest cash, right? Because it can be very parameterized and the optimization function can be written out, and the activities to initiate it and execute it can be fully digital. And so I think we are going to see agentic AI as very much a optimization problem. And it's particularly good where the speed of action has to be really quick. So let's say you're a company and you can get a really good handle on your liquidity at 10 a.m. and you got a ton of cash, maybe not Apple level of cash, but a lot of cash. If I can get in the market early and I can interrogate all my options, I'm going to make a great decision. Now there's third-party platforms that will do that as well, but I think companies are going to have to pick where they insource with their own and where they use a third party.
Even knowing what cash you have available with certainty earlier means you're getting higher quality asset or slightly higher yielding for the same quality.
Yeah. But it might be that actually the best deal is this money fund that we don't have access to. In theory, agentic AI could enroll us in the money fund, read the disclosures, compare them to our legal parameters, approve them, e-sign them, and away we go. So to me, the scope of what agentic AI can do versus RPA is that it can have a level of autonomy that is engineered, whereas RPA is kind of a brute force, very prescribed step by step. Agentic AI, think and optimize within these parameters and within this model of the world and within this level of governance and control. And that just unlocks so much more power of what it can do.
Yeah, it seems like UiPath is one of the RPA models is trying to incorporate much more agentic AI into it to not lose and cede everything over to that, but the power seems pretty massive. Anything else on agentic AI or using agents in Treasury that will become the reality soon? There's been a couple announcements of some of the vendors adding their tie and whomever else to help Treasury groups do things. But besides within the Treasury systems, what else?
Well, if we think about our business consulting, agentic AI is going to be insane, right? So if you think about somebody coming to you with a simple request, hey, I need some policies. Let's make sure we have appropriate controls and governance. Everything you do to do that is probably very parameter driven. What's the nature of your commercial dynamics? What's your legal entity structure? How much financial risk do you want to take? How much financial resiliency do you need? There's a defined finite set of parameters that could automatically create a policy. And so my view of where Treasury consulting is going is that a lot of what was done by people can now be done with agentic AI. And the people are now free to do a much more rigorous dive into the deep issues that really drive. Because a lot of the things that are solvable about agentic AI, there's still a lot of people consulting, whether it's Deloitte or your firm or anyone's, that are spending time on these things that can be automated through agentic AI. And the people probably need to be going deeper into some things, deeper into the implementation, the change management, those kind of issues. And I think within 3 to 5 years, consulting is just going to be radically different and much better value, much bigger impact for companies.
Policy writing's become easier for sure, using some of the tools to not just copy what was done before, but to modify it. One of the things that we've done is we think of at the lowest level might be the desktop procedures or the just procedural level. Then there's the policy level, which should be short. I mean, maybe max of 4 pages, most of them 1 or 2 pages. But we've also, in a number of companies, will use framework documents that may talk about a risk management framework, that from that flows policies on FX risk management, credit risk management, debt risk management, et cetera. And so then you have a cascade of the overall view that flows into the policies and then down further. It seems like that is ripe for being more formalized, and it's easier if an organization is thinking about how do we have a framework for our risk, for our liquidity, for our working capital, for acquisitions that help treasurers do what they need to do.
I think there's a couple of things. One, I think the discretion and the value out of the roles is going to get a lot clearer because you're going to be very intentional about the level of discretion. The second thing I see is I like to refer to policies as a service. And what I mean by that is the policies and controls should be engineered. They shouldn't be a document that people read and put in a drawer, but they should be a system. So if I say the counterparty risk is X, I should be able to measure that throughout the whole longitudinal life of the company. And I should be able to empirically flag when I'm approaching it or when I've broached it, and I should be able to invoke the escalation procedures automatically. So when I think about agentic AI, I think about an engineered treasury that's very explicit on the risk tolerance, on the optimization trade-offs, on the reporting and governance, and that's now embedded in a system that can be empirically executed and governed. That's a radical change. Like, I'm especially excited sort of in the middle market, mid-corp, where they may not have access to treasury expertise, or they may just not have the people to do it. And you have these policies, which quite frankly, you could audit them, but they're not really being empirically attested to.
Or systematically enforced, right?
Yeah.
You have a policy, it's in somebody's head, and then they check it occasionally. And then you run into those problems. It's like I got B of A, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch assets. Now I'm over my 5%.
Yeah.
But my sort routine didn't catch it.
Yeah.
It seems like there's quite a bit that can be done with that runs the process, that checks and compares it. And so then you have more guidance. So if you have sometimes we think of the policies as like, okay, you can't invest more than this percentage or for this duration at this quality level. Well, I always enjoyed one person's description of, it's an envelope. You can flex within that envelope in your policy. It's like if things are good, you might be at the right side or the upper right side. But if things get tight, you pull in your duration or you pull in what's your exposure to, let's say, UK banks or US, $1 trillion bank, whatever those elements are, you can operate within that envelope. And so agentic AI can help you track it, map it, and then as you have kind of your decision criteria within that box, you can follow things more tightly. And so when certain issues start to arise, you get the early warning, you just tighten down some of the parameters for some of your assets, your exposures, or your investments to make that work.
That's a great point. And if you take it a step further, how do you even set the policies in the first place? There's a trade-off, right, with the return and the risk and the efficiency and the simplicity, but that's never really vetted in a rigorous manner. And so you could do one of two things. You could obviously have the policies themselves set with a little bit more financial analysis of what's the trade-off of setting, the maximum AA counterparty at 10% or 20% or a dollar limit. But then as well, you could set a more principle-based set of policies, and agentic AI could optimize within your description of the dynamics. So if something might be AA rated, but if in the market the credit spread is going up, it would just naturally trim that to comply to the portfolio theory that you've described.
I'm not sure when this podcast episode will be released. Our second annual survey on artificial intelligence in Treasury and finance might be over. Then the results will be out. So maybe we'll drop something in the show notes for that. But, generative AI creating, agentic AI doing. What should treasurers do? What's your advice for treasurers, what they should do? And I know it's not going to be nothing. I think it's harmful not to do anything. It's an abdication of what needs to be done. It has to be done with care, but as we tie this up, what's your call to action?
I'll give you the boring answer first, and then
the exciting one.
The more I don't know about exciting, more interesting.
Okay.
I mean, the boring answer is you have to kind of figure out what the guidelines are of the company, right? And you obviously have to comply with that. And I would argue if there are no guidelines, that's really scary. You probably need to make your own guidelines. And if the guidelines are too strict, you probably have to, propose what you want to do and go against that. But I think each treasurer has to sit down and think about what is the treasury going to look like in the future and how am I going to get there? You should always have like a 3-year plan and the next 3 months and 6 months of that. And maybe with AI, depending on where you are in your journey, the next 3 months you're just going to experiment with something around cash forecast variances. But you've got to be doing something tangible, and you've got to be doing it in a way that is congruous with the company's policies and desire to deploy AI. I think the biggest issue is to just start with a single use case and start small. Otherwise, you see people just buying third-party applications with AI. To me, if you're at scale, you need to be getting your hands directly involved in this. There's just too much power there to be intermediated through a vendor.
Do you see a difference between what you do on the generative AI side and on the agentic AI side?
I think the generative is much easier, right? It's kind of a research tool and there's some basic validations and things. Agentic AI really requires you to engineer your treasury and be very rigorous in your thinking about constraints, objective functions, parameters. And it's not like you just put it in place and you're done, right? Because the company changes, the environment changes, the banks change. And so you're building now a new treasury that people are still part of, but these agents are part of it, technology is part of it, and it's got to be sustainable and modified over time.
So if our agents are good enough, we won't need to do the embedded banking or embedded treasury, will we? It'll handle all the doing.
Actually, it'll get even more embedded, right? Because the speed. Yeah.
You
won't have the patience for a bank to not be embedded.
And the new generation is not tolerant of dumb processes.
And friction.
What we call suboptimal, right?
Yeah.
When we're in a consulting firm. But it's dumb.
You and I were quite good at dealing with suboptimal processes. That was our life.
Yeah, and so all those fit together. Mm-hmm. Dave, thanks so much for participating in this episode of the Treasury Update podcast.
Thank you for hosting me. My pleasure.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.